No fresh water. It sounds like a horror movie, but not only could this ancient calamity really have happened, it still happens today.
I think most of us, when we read that passage in the Bible, those of us that have studied this problem, see a very good description of a red tide.
Red tide is a sudden bloom or explosion in the population of a certain kind of algae that can produce dangerous neurochemical compounds.
Don Anderson is a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute and a leading expert on red tides.
When one of these types of blooms occurs, it can be spectacular. The water changes color. There can be very bad smells from the water. The water can actually look like blood. It can be like tomato soup. It can be that red.
Recent outbreaks in Texas and Florida have littered the coast with hundreds of thousands of dead fish.
The fish that are exposed to some of these algal toxins will die in minutes. Very, very rapid death. Many of these toxins are very, very potent. On the human side, there can be human poisonings. There can be some outbreaks where people along the beach can't breathe because the toxin actually gets aerosolized in the sea spray. And you start to cough and wheeze and have to move away from the ocean because of that irritation. In a region like the delta of the Nile, you have the ocean at one side, you have fresh water, and it's in that type of environment where we actually have quite a few of our red tide species that can then make the water red, kill fish, or make fish poisonous, and so forth. And it then becomes a much more solid explanation.
A red tide triggers a number of domino effects and could explain the second biblical plague of frogs. A severe algal bloom can cause extremely low oxygen levels in the water, making it uninhabitable for life.
If there was a red tide, it wouldn't be unusual to expect certain types of animals to try to escape the water because of this low oxygen condition. They can't swim, they can't be underwater, so it's not out of the question that after a major red tide that frogs just can't be surviving in those conditions and are going to come onto land.
They died on land through desiccation, through lack of food supply, and their food supply were the insects. And if you had no check on the insects, you might expect a proliferation of flying insects or crawling insects in the land of Egypt, and that is what the third and fourth plagues were.
The rotting corpses of the dead frogs and fish attract an immense swarm of flies that plague the Egyptians. A huge infestation of lice follows.
Remember, at a time when people didn't have modern antibiotics, when someone was infested with lice, the scratches could lead to infections that could set up other kinds of serious illnesses.
Humans aren't the only ones affected. Decaying carcasses and flying insects can transmit deadly bacteria, and plagues 5 and 6 do just that. Livestock suddenly become sick and die. Both man and beast suffer an affliction of horrifying pus-filled boils.
Here you have a wonderful explanation for how one fed on the other, how one, very much like a domino, caused the tipping of the next domino all the way down from plagues 1 to 10.
Today, antibiotics mean bacterial diseases can be safely treated. But viruses have no such quick fix. And just as in biblical times, our livestock are on the front line of deadly epidemics.
They can be flu viruses that maybe previously had been living in birds or pigs or some other kind of animal, and then some of them, they had evolved that they suddenly could live inside a human host as well.
The recent swine and bird flu outbreaks are warnings humans cannot ignore.
It's seen among a lot of epidemiologists as almost inevitable that at some point, again, you are going to see some kind of bird flu that will evolve to a point that it can take root in human beings and that it can be transmitted much more easily, and it may be more or less deadly.
Surrounded by pestilence and death, the people of Egypt are on their knees. But still the Pharaoh will not be moved. With 4 plagues still to go, the spiral of devastation is far from over. For the Egyptians, the entire empire is on the line. But today, it could be our entire planet in peril.
It's actually probable in a lot of cases that one very bad disaster will set up the possibility for other further bad disasters down the line.
The question is, are we ready for an equivalent of the 10 plagues today?
Halfway through the Bible's 10 plagues, the Nile is contaminated with blood. Dead fish and rotting livestock litter the landscape, while the Egyptians are covered in boils.
I think you put the 10 plagues together, and it's about trying to destroy an entire culture, ultimately till you put them in a watery grave.
No meat, no fish, and nothing to drink. Now, plagues 7 and 8 hit the breadbasket of Egypt. A huge hailstorm batters the wheat fields, and an army of hungry locusts decimate everything in their path.
In the Bible, it said it was the most serious of all of the plagues, even though it didn't kill much in the way of people or animals. But what it did do is kill the Egyptian aspiration of being able to survive.
Today, our own breadbasket is threatened by rising temperatures, which are causing more droughts and stronger storms.
It's pretty difficult to pinpoint exactly what the problems are going to be that humanity faces with this increase in temperatures. But what you can say is that weather is going to get a lot weirder, agriculture is going to have a lot harder time, and we're going to be facing a planet with more people. So you pair all those things together, and you have a pretty grim picture. It's bad news either way for the crops and the farmers.
A hotter planet could also bring a modern plague of pests.
I think the number one surprise that global warming has in store for us is an increase in pests. Already, bark beetles are kind of chewing their way through Canada's forests. We see an increase in mosquitoes, which all the lovely diseases that mosquitoes carry, such as malaria, dengue fever. These are things that we think of as part of the developing world. Well, as the globe warms, the sphere where these mosquitoes can live expands.
In the Bible, the 9th plague becomes the ultimate display of God's power. The descent of total darkness on Egypt.
Imagine their anxiety. Maybe the sun is never coming back. What's going to happen to them?
The hail, storms, and darkness may have all been linked. Some recent studies suggest they are proof that the Bible recorded one of the greatest cataclysms of the ancient world. 500 miles north of Egypt lies the Greek island of Santorini. In the 16th century BC, Santorini was blown apart in one of the largest volcanic explosions of the last 10,000 years.
It was more than 50 times bigger than the Mount St. Helens eruptions in 1980. So it was the largest event that would have been seen in that region, in the Mediterranean, over historic times.
Could the stories of Santorini's explosion have made their way into the Bible?
Well, a volcanic eruption that big would put a plume of material up into the atmosphere, going up 10 to 20 miles. So people would see ash fall raining out of the sky. They would see darkness because the cloud of dust would cut out sunlight.
Recently, physical proof was found that ash from Santorini reached Egypt 530 miles away.
The physical evidence for the ash is ash layers that have been found in a lake on the Nile Delta. So we know that the ash went that way towards the east and fell out over that region.
The eruption could also explain the devastating hailstorms.
Volcanic ash in the atmosphere can cause atmospheric instability, can cause a rainfall or thunderstorms. And in those thunderstorms, you would get hail as well.
Today, one of our famous national parks is a volcanic ticking time bomb with 100 times the explosive power of Santorini in its belly.
Yellowstone is a super volcano. It's had a number of super eruptions. The last one was 600,000 years ago. And when we look at the history of Yellowstone, we see that about every 600,000 years, Yellowstone produces a supervolcanic eruption. So one might say we're overdue for a volcanic eruption of that size in the Yellowstone caldera.
If the Yellowstone caldera were to actually erupt again, if we saw that kind of supervolcano today, we're looking at literally a continent-spanning level of damage.
The Santorini explosion would have killed in the thousands. But if the 30-mile-wide Yellowstone caldera explodes, we could be looking at much worse. Ash in the atmosphere would plunge the entire planet into an apocalyptic winter. The final death toll could be up to 1 billion worldwide.
And so it isn't a question of if the volcano is going to go off again. It's a question of when, and there's no way to stop it.
In the Bible, what finally persuades the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go is not the ruin of his empire, but the death of his firstborn son. The 10th plague kills all firstborn males in the empire.
Every family mourned, and I think that's in some ways the power of that particular plague.
And even this may have been the result of previous plagues. The hailstorms and locusts that destroyed the crops would have forced the Egyptians to rely on stored grain. But grains can grow deadly molds and toxins when stored underground.
The mold produced a very, very powerful chemical, a molecule that's biologically active, and that's called a mycotoxin. And these mycotoxins in de minimis amounts, that is to say a few molecules, can kill humans and animals quite rapidly.
And typically, it would be the firstborn male who was fed the most.
There was a tradition that the eldest usually got double portions, so they're getting more than the amount that the subsequent kids or children would get, and so they would die.
The plagues rip apart an empire, piece by piece. But elsewhere in the Bible, it takes only an instant to destroy a city and its inhabitants. Unfortunately for us, the same is true today. A city where money talks, the good times roll, and the beautiful people live every day like it's their last one on earth. Now, imagine. A dark shadow descends over the Los Angeles skyline. Streams of cinder and ash begin to trickle down from above. Suddenly, the heavens open up and God's wrath is unleashed. Millions of lives are snuffed out in an instant. It's happened before. Genesis chapter 19, verse 24 through 25. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all of the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. Many have tried to locate these